Let's go.
We just started. Tidak, we Tidak, we can't be. I got to people there. You take notes.
Tell me you're ready.
Okay, closing of government.
Yes.
Alright.
Come in. Not started.
We close it off. Okay, whenever you're ready, Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, let's not kid ourselves, right? We all care about one, or like we don't really care about one another. Sure, you come from like a communal background where you were like socially engineered to like, try to care and try to make decisions where you pretend to care, but we think that it's completely pointless for several reasons, right? But the way in which OG set up this debate is very simple. Number one, we will tell you that in terms of morality, your happiness is paramount compared to others' morality. So we think the comparative to not having self-interest is having some level of communal interest. And the spectrum of communal interest, of course, grows. You can care about your immediate neighbors, your friends, or you can care about like states as a whole, and like in terms of nationalism. We'll tell you that all those forms don't subscribe to like a central morality that we prefer. Secondly, we engage on the personal level. In which paradigm would people often be happier, and why happiness is paramount to morality? But secondly, we also analyze to you why in society, if people behave this way and we're very clear in behaving this way, it's a far better world. Number one, this is a philosophical argument in where we tell you that oftentimes the happiness that other individuals feel cannot be like qualified and cannot be quantified in comparison to my level of happiness, right? That means the happiest I've ever been could nowhere in comparison be the saddest you've ever been or the happiness you've ever been, right? That means there is no meeting point in which we can quantify how happy you are and how happy I am. Secondly, we'll also tell you that oftentimes benevolence does not guarantee happiness in other individuals. You think starting a charity, or you think giving like FBI, or you think giving out funds to nation states as a whole is a benevolent thing that oftentimes benefits them. We will tell you that number one, there is no guarantee that every single individual within that particular state or within that particular community will feel happiness, or can you prove to me on the op that that communal happiness of just because more people are happy in that particular scenario outweighs my personal happiness because there's some level of personal sacrifice that I have to go through in making that decision. And thirdly, we'll also tell you that it's completely pointless because sometimes even when you act in benevolence and even when you care about one another, oftentimes the decision is not contrived that way. The road to hell is oftentimes paved with good intentions, where in the sense that we will argue to you that that person, even when you try to act in their best interest, oftentimes does not feel that they gain the benefit. Even if they do, they don't feel satisfied with that. So we think all those forms of morality in terms of an individual trying to make another person happy or an individual trying to succumb to interest of a lot of other people don't meet the moral standards. What are moral standards that we will tell you, right? So this is like where we enter the epistemological positioning of this debate, right? We don't understand different individuals' morality, firstly. Secondly, there is no conclusive proof that everyone else in this room is alive, right? I think, therefore I am. And the only thing that I can guarantee, at the very least, is I am alive and I am like my entire body. Like Sherman could be a robot, you could all be simulations. These are all like necessary things to encompass within a philosophical debate where we cannot be certain if other people actually exist. Under those presumptions, and if individuals continue to live in those presumptions, why is there a far preferable world? Because at the very least, you can guarantee your individual levels of happiness in comparison to thinking about and hoping your actions can benefit another individual. But then there comes upon this question, would benevolence still exist? To which we tell you that oftentimes benevolence is just a right? Because they feel happiness from it, right? There's something that helps them. A good only reason why people do benevolence. No one does benevolence where they are completely selfless and don't get some level of benefit from it. So we can co-opt the benefits of benevolence because people still have an incentive. Because benevolent individuals will continue being benevolent because they contrive happiness from it. The comparative and where these are log-hit, when oftentimes your benefit comes at a harm of another individual. I firstly posit to you this other individual does not exist for a certain fact that I have to care about this individual. Secondly, I cannot quantify what makes them happy and what makes them unhappy. And like thirdly, oftentimes their levels of happiness, even though they feel happy, maybe my happiness would have been levels higher of that certain levels of happiness. Why must I sacrifice this much of happiness for something that you could have gained marginally? There is no guarantee of these things. Hence, it is pointless to now care about another person. Secondly, we'll tell you about how societies function and why it's far preferable. Before that, yes, ma'am.
Given that happiness can't be quantified, as you said, isn't it safest that we opt for the guarantee that we have from society's functionality that is also premised upon you caring of other people?
Correct. So like this is contingent on three key things, right? Just because you act in a communal interest, guarantees you the community feeling happy, right? Like sure, like me giving you like pizza, like might like make you feel happy or unhappy. You could be allergic to pineapples. I could not know this, right? You could probably like pasta more. Like there is no guarantee that my actions cause you happiness or that is an important levels of happiness. Secondly, why if society behaves in this way? And this is where we mechanize our arguments a bit more, right? Under the status quo, because we value benevolence significantly, and oftentimes benevolent policies or benevolent individuals are the ones that are celebrated, and oftentimes selfish individuals are the ones that are shared upon, that is highly problematic. Because it's positive to you that everyone is selfish. It's the ways in which you achieve your goals that matter apparently in the status quo. We think that it's problematic. Because oftentimes what individuals will do is saying that we're doing things that are helping societies when it's helping themselves. A good example would be Mara, right? It seems like a benevolent thing of educating the masses, right? But what is problematic with it? They only do this as far as when they can like make more and more individuals subscribe to their particular narrative of being a Bhumiputra or believing in the national identity of a singular race and continues to perpetuate that. So we tell you that Mara or like a lot of scholarship bodies have no benevolence in terms of like their risk calculus analysis, right? Oftentimes they only do this because it's self-beneficially to themselves. Comparatively, we have like private institutions like Help and Taylors, right, who go about very clearly about what are the incentive structures. They are there to make profit. But why do they consecutively lose out to government universities? Is because of this facade of happiness and because of the premium that we put on committing to social good. We would far prefer a world where like if everyone put their cards on the table and said very clearly, this is our incentive structures. That means you make more of an informed choice. That means knowing that you joining Mara would mean you have subscribed to some level of brainwashing that believing that Malays are really better than you. We think that if you did not know this before subscribing, that's problematic. At the very least, you'd make more informed decisions. Before I move on, yeah, mate, go for it.
So just be clear about what you believe human beings are like. Do you believe that people's natural inclination is towards self-interest?
Yeah, definitely. Like, why do you think I want to win this round? You think what I want to give my points to you? No, right? I don't care about you, mate. You go or die. But like, but this is where I do some like mitigatory work, right? Why human beings would be still inherently moral, right? This is where I go to an argument. If you place the human being in a cave for the rest of time, and then you took him out, why you will still be a moral individual, right? Because number one, we have been biologically engineered to be adverse towards causing pain to other individuals. How do we draw this comparison? Why does this exist, right? Because number one, knowing you've caused pain to another individual directly means that you feel some level of guilt, you feel some level of shame, you feel that you have done something that has like harmed the species as a whole. This oftentimes like reduces your extent of how far you're willing to go in certain actions, right? Why do you feel this way? And why is it important that this thing is taken into account? Because oftentimes this is comparatively, at the very least, you will not go bonkers. But what is the problems in their work? When you have societal good, often things can be very easily traded off. The reason why Hitler started the revolution, oftentimes invaded a lot of countries, was because he thought he had the German people's good at like his heart, right? So the trade-offs become so much more easier. When I'm doing something beneficial for a community, I can kill so many other communities because I'm getting large amounts of benefit. When it's comparatively to you as a singular individual, you're less likely to make the trade-offs because you understand what's at risk. So to propose.
Thank you very much. Start the office. I'd like to invite the opposition.
Here.
establish a fair context with other sides to defend the extremes of what self-interest necessarily is like. I think in government, what we are proposing is the idea that individuals are, as Mithun told you, naturally averse to suffering, which is to say that to act in self-interest means that you are more likely than not to try and avoid the worst kinds of suffering for the people around you, because that is in your self-interest in terms of the comfort that you get. However, we are not saying that this means that you are likely to be philanthropic and give out all your money, but we are saying that we can probably justifiably claim that you will not get the worst atrocities that come from psychopaths. In the same breath, we don't think that opposition necessarily can argue that everyone's going to go out to be selfless and they are going to give out all of their money and the like, but rather they can argue that the probability of individuals going out there to do higher on their side, recognizing on both sides of the house that there will still be individuals whose self-interest is intimately tied towards other-centric values, because that is how they gain utility as well. The other side simply supports more of these individuals coming out in order, because that's a guiding moral principle in their lives. Let's first talk about the philosophical aspect of this particular debate, because I think the open-endedness of this motion allows us to do that. Firstly, I would want to argue that on an aggregate, because I think they misunderstand the idea of quantifiable. So to the extent to which you may not buy the analysis that Mithun gave you about how the only knowable thing is the self, and therefore self-interest is important, but at least on an aggregate, what we can ensure is that given that you're not able to quantify the happiness of another person, because I can't access your mind, I don't know what exactly or the amount of happiness or sadness that you feel from a particular act, the most amount of utility that I can potentially gain or happiness comes from the actions that I do for myself and for my own self-interest, which is to say that if you continually act in the self-interest of others, you can never actually be sure whether or not the spread of the altruism that you have done creates huge or vast amounts of quantities of happiness for other people. But when you do things for yourself, you can be sure that that amount of quantity of happiness you created for yourself is great, which means on aggregate, if everyone acts in self-interest, they are more likely than not able to gain greater vast quantities of happiness for themselves versus an untenable or ambiguous amount of happiness they can gain for other people, which means that across the board on aggregate, we are more likely to have more happiness because people are acting their self-interest and gain utility from that, than a world in which you have ambiguous outcomes with regards to everyone acting altruistically but not being able to ensure the quantity of happiness or the outcomes or things that affect the outcomes of the things that they are doing on their side of the house. So that's why we think that on a personal level, an individual ought to fight for self-interest as a whole. But let's talk about the debate that they wanted to have, right? Because they were very focused on the idea of society and people being altruistic in order to work out in the way that they want to. So firstly, note that if they recognize that people are inherently quite selfish, then I think what they are fighting for is basically individuals being at odds with themselves. You can't at the same breath argue that somehow now being other-centric exposes you to a new world that gives you vast quantities of self-interest, to the extent to which you want to argue that people are inherently selfish. Yeah, Miss.
So that argument about everybody pursuing self-interest, that being the most sure thing, presumes that everybody has equal access to be able to make themselves happy, and that happiness is not zero-sum. If you making yourself happy takes away resource from others, that in aggregate causes more pain for others and everyone is less.
Yeah, so I was just about to move on and talk about that, because this is the society level function that you're talking about, right? So I'm going to argue a couple of things here. The first thing that I would argue is that this idea of altruism is unlikely to exist, to the extent to which we recognize that other-centric values oftentimes in practice does not happen as a uniform idea, which is to say that in my life, I probably care more deeply about the people who are close to me, like Mithrun, like Amrit, all of these people, for example, and I'm more likely to, and Vera, and I'm more likely to act in the interest of these individuals rather than the interest of other people in the world. Without being a particular good, but rather just creates different forms of inequality with regards to the people that I actually want to fight for against others. So we agree that it's a zero-sum, or it is a zero-sum game, then it is more likely than not that I will fight for the zero-sum to be on the side of the people I care about rather than the people that I don't care about. But secondly, I would argue that material comfort and happiness comes more from individuals who care deeply about self-interest rather than not. Because recognize that firstly, the big problem on their side is a guiding principle in society of altruism is one in which it allows for the exploitation of systems of values in ways that are disproportionate if people care about self-interest instead. What does this mean? It means that in a world in which you propagate altruism and people believe this to be the good thing to do, you are more likely than not going to create a scenario in which people are able to exploit the altruism of other individuals, recognizing that everybody is selfish on some level. You cannot mechanize out the individuals who don't care about this guiding principle of altruism and continue to exploit the system, therefore gaining much more advantages in comparison to a world in which the focus on self-interest means that you're able to guard yourself and potentially the people who are close to you against such exploitations to begin with. But the next thing that I want to argue is the idea of like efficiency, right? So recognize that economics as a whole tends to rely on the fact that individuals are rational self-actors, and that's the easiest and best possible way to be able to create policy. The reason why this is so is because we recognize that the strongest motivating force is the material comfort of yourself and the material comfort of the interest that you hold dear to yourself, which means that on their side of the house, they have to defend why they are okay with a world in which you don't harness this specific motivation, but rather try to compel or fight against human interest in order to fight for something, in order to create like more wealth and etc. So to the extent to which everyone is self-interested, we are happy to say that this means they are much more likely to be motivated to work much harder in order to create more progression. So to the extent to which they are fighting for self-interest, these benefits oftentimes trickle down in many different ways. So either firstly, because for example, things like wanting to earn more money is oftentimes the strongest possible motivator to invest greatly in research and development that allows for the creation of drugs or technology that create huge amounts of material comfort for everyone else. So even if the access to these things are something that is limited, we think that over time this tends to democratize like around more people, but in the converse, it is less likely that altruism will be able to create the same speed of progress that their side seems to suggest that it would. But also, I would argue that to a large extent, self-interest allows us to bulwark against the inequalities that you speak of as well. Because oftentimes things like Occupy Wall Street, for example, are reflections of a person's self-interest as well, where they feel that they have been cheated by a system that is unjustified. But in a world in which you fight for altruism, you're telling individuals the same way that religion does, that it is okay for you to suffer because your suffering is able to provide benefits to someone else. But if you recognize that the individual themselves continues to suffer in that scenario, either materially or philosophically in terms of their mind, for instance, continually telling them that altruism is good only perpetuates a system where inequality, in the way that we spoke of earlier of exploitation, is allowed to fester in ways that are unfair to people because they're not able to fight for their rights to come out of it. A actual acknowledgement of the fact that self-interest is the way that people are, both firstly serves much better for a personal gain, but secondly we think creates a society that's much fairer as well because people are afraid and want to bulwark against the fact that they might suffer in the future. We're happy to propose.
Alright, thank you very much. To close the opening half, I'd like to invite the deputy leader.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Members of the floor, I'm not going to let government get away with the characterization that this debate is about a moral qualm of whether or not human beings are self-interested or not.
Yeah.
Because the debate that we wanted to talk about, which is exactly the motion, is about whether or not you think you should take on the position of celebrating the idea that self-interest ought to be your primary guiding principle, or at least one that you are willing to go out and publicly declare in support of. Because humans have an instinct of survival of the fittest, to be selfish, which is exactly why we told you, and Naja was very clear in this, that in order to counteract a lot of the very primal instincts that we have to become selfish, that's why the counter narrative should be in celebration of selflessness in order for you to achieve the balance to get a functioning society that would eventually lead to a distribution of not just wealth, but a distribution of happiness. That oftentimes, in order to get that kind of distribution of happiness, you have to make choices that come at the expense of yourself. Second thing I'm not going to let government get away with is this cop-out case that came out from Prime Minister, which was eventually kind of that sacrifice to see some still eventually make for anything that you do in life right now in this debate amounts to self-interest. I think you need to be fair to the opposition, right? Because otherwise I'm questioning what your celebration looks like. What are they going to tell the people? What are you going, what's the narrative you're holding? Is it prioritize yourself. Oh, but at the same time, please do help other people. Oh, but please be selfish. Oh, but sometimes you gotta make choices that make sure societal's, functioning. Because eventually you have to acknowledge the fact that celebrating self-interest as a guiding principle means that it comes at the expense of talking about helping other people for the overall functioning of society. So at best, what is government left with? I think at best they're left with this idea that self-interest and the starting point of becoming self-interest eventually leads us to a world that would benefit everybody. I'm going to debunk that based on my two questions. Number one, why we think that there is importance in celebrating selflessness as a guiding principle. And secondly, why we think even if self-interest is important, why the celebration of selflessness as a guiding principle becomes a precursor in order for you to get better self-happiness. First question, why celebrating selflessness is important as a guiding principle? Because notice that DLO was unengaging with what Naja told you. Naja told you the idea about celebrating self-interest as a guiding principle means that you are ignorant or happy with the idea that oftentimes you live a life that comes at the expense of others. It means that oftentimes it's really difficult for you to want to introspect or make compromises that may end up diluting the own benefits that you may make, right? Because if you notice, the idea about self-interest is that you constantly want to maximize the benefit that you get out of your own end within the negotiating table. But the point at which you are less likely to make compromises in, like, I don't know, if you happen to be a person who's in position of power, whether it's in corporate businesses, whether it's in the government, whether it's within activisms and what sort of like compromises you need to make with other social groups in order to forward your policy to be heard. Oftentimes you are less likely to make compromises, which means that you are less likely to get any forms of outcome or any forms of materialization of the intentions that you had, because you are less likely to negotiate and listen to people, because listening, engaging means diluting a lot of the initial benefits that you were supposed to accrue at its maximum level. But secondly, what we also heard coming from OG was that self-interest eventually helps other people via the hunger to gain like material wealth, i.e. like if you wanted a lot of money, you're very likely to invest in R&D in big pharma that eventually creates jobs, lots of net, yada yada. I think that this is highly contingent on several things. Firstly, that I think the idea that you wanting to take on a role that eventually fulfills society oftentimes also comes from a position of selflessness. Like a lot of people aim to become real good politicians or like want to be a doctor. Like oftentimes don't always stem from, I want to be rich. Sure, some people have that, but oftentimes needing to endure a lot of the difficulties in what it means to become a doctor or to become an impactful politician is filled with a lot of selflessness, that you can only survive that occupation if you know that you are sacrificing for people who actually need your help, that you are in a position of power and you're the only one who can do it. That stems, the idea of getting the meaningful job stems from the position of selflessness. But secondly, even if you got that job, with the absence of selflessness as a guiding principle, you are less likely to invest in a lot of projects that would otherwise help people, right? That's how you get a lot of big pharmas that are more money-minded, that oftentimes they create medicine that only help people within their regions, or help or only are willing to, like if you're a media company, only willing to cover stories that are deemed sexy and not necessarily what actually urgently needs to be discussed within society. That means you don't get a lot of the meaningful change that you initially asserted in this debate. So I think that's problematic. If you notice, a lot of these benefits are filled with a lot of challenges that individuals can only persevere through if they know they're doing it for a bigger meaning. But secondly, why we think even if self-interest is important, why celebration of selflessness as a guiding principle becomes a precursor for that better self-happiness. Before I move on, are there any questions?
Yeah. So your case seems to be premised on the idea that celebrating selflessness results in some sort of equilibrium that allows people to balance both motivations. But why is it not likely that the celebration of selflessness as a guiding principle is able to pressure individuals into accepting exploitation at the expense of their own happiness?
Okay, selflessness doesn't mean that you are stupid, right? I think it is fair for people to say that you can become selfless, but oftentimes, if you want to say that, oh, what happens if you put yourself at jeopardy? I think it's also about like a scale of jeopardy, right? Sometimes you have to take small hits in order for a greater outcome at the end of the day. Like sometimes you're not going to be able to accrue as much money as before. You're not going to be able to accrue as much popularity at the beginning. But it all means that if you have more selflessness, you eventually get like a much better world in which you maximize happiness for everybody. Second question as to why we think even if self-interest is the objective, why? selflessness is a precursor to that. They said that happiness can't be quantified. But the problem is that if it's true that happiness can't be quantified, you want to maximize your channels in achieving happiness. And one of the ways in which you do that, right? Things like what Naja said. If you are constantly championing self-interest, the moment you are leading a comfortable content life, you are less likely to introspect, do research, ask yourself, what can you do to make the world a better place, even if currently you are living a comfortable life? It means that you're more willing to go out, help those who are suffering, activism, charity, make compromises, even if it dilutes your own benefits. At the end of the day, you end up feeling fulfilled, but only through channels that you initially could not have thought of because you never thought to put yourself out there. And sometimes the idea of selflessness, the idea of sacrifice can only bring you happiness at the end of the day, things that you were initially unfamiliar with because you weren't willing to challenge yourself into thinking that sometimes you need to not think about yourself first, think about other people, that eventually that may be leading us to a much better world. Whew, it's 7:30. Thank you.
I'm going to start doing this yourself.
Alright, thank you very much. Start the closing half. I'd like to invite the member of class. Here.
Yeah. It's my Cooper brother.
What's your name, friend?
Cooper.
This one you got.
Yes. What is this?
Are you recording them? Did you ask them? Just ask them.
You all can. Yeah. Apart from the show.
No? I mean, for your personal
CNN won't care about this. They have other shit to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. Madam Speaker, insofar as we as average reasonable voters care about nice things happening to people in the world, we from Closing Government are going to extend on achieving a lot of the aims that the opening opposition wanted to achieve. That is a world in which we maximize the happiness not just of the person who's the actor of that action, but like in general, people all around the world. I'm going to do that in a number of ways. First of all, I'm going to tell you how this policy, a world in which self-interest is like the opposite of self-interest is altruism or other forms of communitarian obligations are fetishized. We think that is a world in which the people who are the most vulnerable are burdened by that obligation, Madam Speaker, and that makes them the most unhappy in those scenarios. I'm going to talk about other stuff, but I'll label that as I go along. Okay. Vulnerable people, Madam Speaker, right? We think the alternative to this debate is a world in which some level of obligation is imposed upon people. So they believe that either they have some obligation to their family or some obligation to the community, the religious community that they belong to, or some obligation to the nation, right? It's the important thing to realize here is that that obligation is most easily impressed upon people who are the most vulnerable, the most powerless, right? Because the people who are powerful are able to get away by not fulfilling those obligations. For the people who don't have any power in society are the ones who are told that you must do this in order to be a moral individual, otherwise you are a rogue, Madam Speaker, right? We think that is problematic because those people are then made to sacrifice things that are important to them, innocent pleasures that are important to their lives, Madam Speaker, and for the greater good. I think there are a number of examples that we find for this in our society that range from the minutest of things to like broad social movements. The first example that I want to point to, something that has happened across the world, is the experiences of the LGBT community that is at the point where it wants to come out of the closet, at the point where it wants to express its religious preference, its sexual preference. It is told there's not something you ought to do because you are letting the family name down, or it's an obligation that you have towards your religious community to not do this particular thing, even though that may be in that self-interest, Mr. Speaker. These people, it's not just the case that they limit themselves for doing that for other reasons. It's also they feel guilty for doing that because they believe that they are exercising an immoral choice. In a world in which self-interest is fetishized and said that this is the thing that you ought to do, Mr. Madam Speaker, we think that self-limitation would not exist. We think other examples extend to the ways that women in many of these societies are forced into marriages, etc., and are told to continue and not do anything about this in the name of the honor of the family, Madam Speaker. But I think the broader social manifestation of this is the example of minority movements, Madam Speaker, because when they actually want to protest and whenever they want to do something about their about expressing their grievances, they are told that this is not the proper time to do this, or for example, you're disrupting the functioning of the state, you're closing down shops, you are causing a lot of unrest, right? Like a lot of 1MDB protests were like criticized for the precise reason that like you're holding, like blocking roads and like blocking access and blocking traffic and doing a lot of things that are hurtful for the functioning of the state. We think minority movements are labeled as immoral for doing that, and other people also don't support that at the point they feel that people are exercising an immoral choice. In a world in which their self-interest and their desire to be an okay thing, Madam Speaker, is we think on our side, the self-interest is a thing that's acceptable. Minorities are less affected by the oppression of the majority for a number of reasons. Because we think right now, in our world, there are things that the minorities can do to like adjust to the life under an oppressive majority, right? So for example, African American individuals can go that if we act white or if we do this, this may actually solve some of our problems, right? We don't need to join gangs. We don't need to, for example, like do rap songs or like these kinds of things and actually buy wholesale into the white culture, and the white man will accept us. We think that's a choice that they ought to be able to do. But the way that that choice is denounced right now by the African American community is by saying that you are betraying the community, is by saying that that's something that you ought not to do because you are spitting on the sacrifices of every African American individual that existed before you. So we think insofar as neither side can solve the problems that exist like to the minorities across the world, at the very least we are able to significantly mitigate many of those problems in the world in which people can make adjustments to themselves. Now, next thing I want to talk about is in general the idea of morality, right? Of people wanting to be altruistic and helping people in the world in general, Madam Speaker. We think that, before I move on here.
Your issue seems to be with which selfless reasoning you follow as opposed to selflessness per se. Why can't you fight for gay rights as a religious kid because you sympathize the gay community, which is still selfless nonetheless?
That's not an argument that I made so far. I've talked about like gay kids themselves and how they feel about themselves, right? So I don't know what you're addressing. I'll talk about altruism, Madam Speaker. We think on our side, and I think it cannot be disputed, that people have a moral instinct in general, right? Many of the reasons that Mithran gave, like it's just biologically engineered. We feel sorrowful when we see other people in pain, etc. And we want to help them. Often it's an extension of our self-interest, right? We think that this is something we ought to do because we feel happiness by doing that. We think that the problem that exists under the current world is that instinct is co-opted at a very early stage by other structures such as the family, such as the nation, such as the community, Madam Speaker. It doesn't allow the fullest realization of that instinct to help people. We think it is on our world where you achieve the best and the most effective ways of helping the people. Because currently what happens is if you're a person who's like living in a society, you grow up knowing that you have to meet certain obligations, sit down towards your family. You need to do some things for your community, right? Even if you start earning, that's an obligation that you owe towards like contributing to your particular nation, right? We think that moral burden doesn't allow you to conceptualize other ways of like ever helping other people. We think if individuals were in fact living in a cave and feeling that self-interest was their only duty, and if they realize that actually I want to help other people, that will allow them to consider the most effective ways in which you could go about helping other people. We think if you recognize, Madam Speaker, movements such as, you're out of order, movements such as effective altruism are actually the most, like, not joined by people who are like the most religious, etc., or people who are the most altruistic in general. It's joined by people who are like millennials, etc., who live lives of freedom, etc., do what they want, but they feel that this is the best way in which they can exercise their desire of helping in the world. And we think that's important. It's more important to be able to like donate some dollars to kids in Africa and save many lives rather than just going about helping your family, which is a much more insignificant good compared to that. The final thing I want to talk about is relationships. And this is like at a human level, right? We think that relationships in general are better on our side at the point where people feel that they can't take the other party's interest in them for granted. They feel that they constantly need to do something to justify the fact that they are with someone, the fact that they are friends with someone, the fact that they are married to someone, right? We think on their side, things like the idea of fidelity is used to like oppress people in things like abusive marriages or things that they can't get out of, right? You know, in our world, you feel that you need to constantly justify that by saying things like we like need to match up to what we ought to be in order to be with you in a relationship. For those reasons, Madam Speaker, a number of reasons, but we think we do the most good in the world. Very proud.
All
Yeah.
right, thank you very much. To start with slow case, I'd like to invite the member one.
Yeah.
The problem in this debate so far, the closing government specifically, is that they problematize why apparently being selfless sometimes may not get you great outcomes or the ideal outcomes, but conversely provide us no analysis whatsoever as to why acting in self-interest will be able to mechanize those changes as well. So a few examples, like if you're the gay kid trapped in your community, I'm not quite sure how you become less trapped in your community if your family still controls your life, your money and all those things, as opposed to the converse, which probably is more important, that you get the community to be more selfless in trying to be sympathetic towards the gay kid on the outside of the house. Or if you're talking about this trap on the outside of the house society, does the woman suddenly become more powerful the moment she says to herself, I am now self-interested? Do I stop being under the care of my father? Do I start being able to become independent? Or is it more effective to create a sympathetic, more selfless society where patriarchal societies are more likely to care about what the woman wants in this particular circumstance and then give up their control over that woman in this particular circumstance? We think that Sharia gives us no operationalized whatsoever as to why being selfish will actually manifest the changes in this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, my extension in this debate is firstly, I think it's worth pointing out that while opening opposition was very good in terms of telling us that we need to position ourselves to really in order to balance our natural instincts towards being selfish. But I think a few layers of characterization are important in order to know how we think societies fundamentally break down one. But number two, the long-term self-interest beyond just feeling good about yourself, beyond just feeling good about people, the actual tangible things that are about self-interest are harmed as a result of encouraging selfish behavior in this debate. I think it's worth noting that when it comes to whether people are able to see what is their long-term interest, people are more often around short. I think that's the first piece of characterization, because it's easy to see interest. It's difficult to be able to think others will lead sometimes structural changes that might benefit you into the future, ladies and gentlemen. The ability to trust that selflessly acting in the interest of others will benefit you is incredibly difficult step for the vast majority of people to take. But secondly, is that people are often incredibly impatient as well. Like when you see self-interest dangling in front of you, people often think the short-sighted, immediate return that they have in front of them, as opposed to the long-term interest that may accrue for them. But the last thing is that for the vast majority of people, the layman, as Sharia pointed out, is that these people don't have access to information, the ability for them to know what their choices will create as repercussions into the future. In this reality, ladies and gentlemen, you see three pieces of characterization. What kind of social narrative and culture do we cultivate in order for people to be able to acknowledge those long-term implications of their actions and maneuver around those limitations of the status quo? And that's by creating a selfless society. Why? Because in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, when poor individuals, when people in the middle class, or for example, people in general, ladies and gentlemen, act in their personal interest, act in selfish behavior, ladies and gentlemen, they do things like, for example, the tax evasion, things like the lobby for a reduction in middle income tax, things like when dealing with a bailout in an economic of that is crisis, the unbe able to take more economic burdens on programs for the poor because you think that they're lazy, they're not self-interested enough, they don't work hard enough, ladies and gentlemen, that the long-term implications of that is that social barriers break down. Things like social safety nets break down, ladies and gentlemen. Naja said very accurately that sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down. We think that's a little bit simplistic, right? We think that it is oftentimes the case that those social safety nets what contributes to whether you can stay where you are or not, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that a banker's ability to be able to keep their job also is contingent upon whether or not many bankers are acting in their own self-interest. Finally, create things like the global financial crisis and the melting down of global economies, leading to many people losing their jobs in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. The ability for you to empathize, act in other people's interests, moderate your self-interest, ladies and gentlemen, allows you to avoid this tragedy of the commons where everyone pursues their self-interest and finally breaks down the system which allows everybody to be able to garner the things that they want and be in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. Yes.
So both houses can cherry pick and give examples of
Yeah,
when
yeah.
self-interest or when like communal good can lead to benefit or harm. I think you need to answer why must I care about another person because OG told you why you care
Correct.
about
That's why in this debate, the reason why the op bench will take it over you is because we started the debate characterizing what is the status quo in regards to people's natural inclination of an instinct. If people's natural inclination is towards self-interest, that means large portions of your harms are mitigated at the end of the day. The only analysis that Mithram gives us as to why there's a natural inclination towards caring about other people is really feels guilty whenever we do something bad to other people. You know where that guilt starts from? Is from the self-reflection of thinking about other people's interests first. It's a chicken and egg situation on your side house. How are you going to feel guilty about whether or not you are screwing over another person if you never start thinking about whether or not someone else's interest is hurtful to begin with? No analysis whatsoever on the their side as to whether or not thinking about other people's interests is an instinctual thing or it's a constructed thing, ladies and gentlemen. I think we've proven to you through analysis that it's in fact constructed as to whether or not people continuously self-reflect upon putting themselves in other people's shoes in that particular regard. So at this point, there's no characterization whatsoever on the government to explain to us how do you reach the equilibrium under their side, ladies and gentlemen. So what have we proven at this point? We think it's exceptionally important to note that the closing opposition provided material in regards to, number one, the inability for individuals to perceive long-term interests as well as the ability how their minute actions contribute to fundamental failures of societies in general, ladies and gentlemen. If it is true that a government bench's interest in this circumstance is to ensure that there's sustainable and continuous ability for people to be able to access their own rights, then the only way for you to be able to access those things is that if people can suspend their own personal interests, people who have otherwise not have any information, people who have otherwise just acted in robust self-interest, ladies and gentlemen, can just suspend that belief, ladies and gentlemen, and then pursue a selfless behavior, even if it may not seem rational, and return them anything in the short term. Because eventually, ladies and gentlemen, it creates significantly better societies, serves self-interest better as fulfilling their goal, and finally creates fairer and better societies at the end of the day. You don't screw over the poor, you don't screw over the weak, and fundamentally you help the individuals that need to be helped and serve people's personal interests more. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. To continue the debate, I'd like to invite the culprit.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Come on, bye.
Come on, bye.
Bye.
Can I start? Madam Speaker, it's been 3 years since I've been debating, and Mifzal hasn't changed. He still mischaracterizes stuff. He still cherry picks versions of argumentations and doesn't belong or doesn't go to the charitable version of debate in which it happens on a reasonable ground. Right? Don't let him get away with that. Don't let him get away with mischaracterized cherry pick version of selflessness, right? Because he can't claim complete altruism, along with all of the benefits of changing societal conceptions, of people in patriarchal societies changing the conceptions on a very hypothetical basis of people in Christianity becoming less homophobic on day one. We don't think those things exist simultaneously. We think at the point of time we allow people to be self-interested and we allow individuals oppressed by those communities to be self-interested, we at least allow them a channel to resist those things. At the point of time he claims that both these individuals and the gay and Christianity and patriarchal societies will lose them, we don't think it's a reasonable claim to make, because at the point of time you need selflessness or you need self-interest for them to change. We don't think that selflessness completely comes with the ability of these particular parties to change. You can't claim serving the gay community as selfless, as inherently selfish that you help them and coalesce with them and help them because you relate to them on a very intrinsic value, right? The burden and ops defend on a mechanistic value or an operationalized value as to why they reach the ability of those societies to become completely selfless, even in terms of conception that sexual relationship, right to like drive and so on and so forth. He can't claim that those things exist simultaneously. We tell you on our side, at least with self-interest, you allow them the ability to coalesce and resist at the point of time they can come together and resist the oppression that they have served. We tell you, second thing he tells you is that, oh, society will break down because people won't pay taxes anymore. Look at Singapore. At the point of time where many people give away their civil liberties, such as CPF, such as taxes, etc., given that they've been convinced that it's in their long-term self-interest, we think governments can do that anyway, because at the point of time you can convince it's in the people's long-term interest to push forth for society to become better, for the infrastructure to exist, and so on and so forth. It becomes far better that you contribute to society and society serves you well. Sit down. Lastly, what opening opposition tells us, right? They tell us that behind a veil of ignorance, you will possibly be more altruistic or help individuals more. We tell you on our side, and completely through government, we have told you that you don't lose morality. We don't need to defend hedonism within individuals. We can defend a reasonable conception of self-interest, balanced with the idea that often self-interest and helping society serves to benefit you as well. We think enlightened egoism exists, Madam Speaker, where people often need to like, for example, like Bill and Melinda Gates often serve individuals within society because it creates happiness for them. It creates possibly some sort of value that they see from that particular action, where it derives value from helping others. We think helping others more often than not is aimed to serve oneself, and Shari's case becomes really valuable here, right? Where it becomes on our side a more effective manner of redistribution. We're not constrained and chained by coalesces and collective identities of race, religion, etc., contributing to those particular identities only. At the point of time you serve particular self-interest to get happy, you can possibly create your own identity as to what you need to help within society and what you need to benefit. Sit down. We think you're not constrained by race, religion, or like nationality, etc., in terms of what you donate to or what you help. We think it's far better on our side that people serve the self-interest where they determine what the best case of society or the best possible outcome for society is. So what are the alternatives that OP actually had to defend, right? They either had to defend an altruistic identity or a utilitarian-based identity within society. Let's deal with both those things, right? If they defended altruism, it can work in two ways. Either you do what others want you to do. That's the most effective case of altruism coming from Mifsal. It means that you give up your own morality and actions. This necessarily contradicts what opening opposition told you, that given that people are inherently self-motivated and fetishize the self-interest, given that they cannot overcome that part of their identity, that means that case is unrealistic where you never compromise your own individuality and own individual actualization in order to serve others in the way that you want to do. What Mithran told you and what Shai told you exclusively after that is that you often like compromise your ability and you often exploit yourself to serve the others, which means that it's an unrealistic scenario for opposition to claim on their side. The second thing they can reasonably claim is what you feel is best for them, so that you do to others what you think is best for them. The primary conception that goes behind this is that it makes you the actor that determines what people's benefits are, or what will make people happy given the actions that you take, which necessarily means that you tend to serve your own self-interest given that you determine the happiness of others. At that point of time where you determine the happiness of others in the altruistic version, they can reasonably claim on their side. We think it's far better that you serve your self-interest and possibly have a more effective means of redistribution and altruism within society. What about utilitarianism, right? We think morality allows you for often to trade away others' ability to actualize. It codifies into moral philosophy that allows you as the collective outfin to infringe on individual rights. We think it's far better that we serve self-interest or fetishize self-interest under our side, that at the point of time you have curated a good balance between what serves society better, given that you have curated that identity in your own head, as told to you by Shari, but more importantly, you've curated what others needs to help them in the best way possible, rather than arbitrary lines that utility draws or that utility tries to draw, given that it often infringes on individuals' ability to actualize with what they believe in. Sit down. So what is the thing that we told you exclusively from closing up? We told you that, and keep the rebuttal that I had in mind with regards to Mifsal cherry picking and like mischaracterizing argumentation of selflessness. I think individual conception is inherently important in self-interest. We think Shari gave you deep and comprehensive analysis on self-interest, how it often transcends arbitrary values such as patriarchal norms, etc. But before I go on,
you and helping and break your cut off child can help.
A point of time where every individual celebrates the idea of self-interest, and it often coalesces into movements that often resist those patriarchal norms or resist those norms that have often oppressed you. We think it's far better that every individual serves their self-interest instead of waiting on society to become selfless in a hypothetical manner not explained to us by opening opposition or closing opposition. We think vulnerable individuals like closeted homosexuals, bad women, etc. are not able to actualize in their individuality under their side. We think minority movements like the liberation of oppressed communities are often not able to coalesce into movements that often serve their interests. But lastly, and more importantly, what Shari told you is that the social consciousness belief becomes because of celebration, you're serving your self-interest, mean that contracts are now often enforced and things work are exclusively exclusively on our side mutually beneficial, right? Why is that? This means that when parties enter into negotiations and agreements, they only and only agree when both of them benefit at the same point of time, given that self-interest necessitates that particular transaction. Betters arbitrarily some form of societal need wants to value. This means legislation of things like ODS, debt, etc. are now ingrained into individual and societal philosophical consciousness, Madam Speaker, and it's very important that we support that. Very proud. Thank you.
I don't think you can.
Huh?
I think you
Yeah, I know.
No, that's personal live stream.
It's so stupid. You literally shut the fuck up. You should shut the fuck up.
All the time.
Just start that. Mithrun can come back, ask you why later.
Consented to this big one.
I think you can say.
So you are assuming consensus.
Utility.
But it's
Yes.
that's what we meant and never comes back. That's actually possible.
Very best, can you?
Yeah.
Alright, I went off with. Yeah.
since ABP, just the same as the ABP finals. He makes cheap shots, condemns argument, doesn't provide analysis. Maybe if he changes, perhaps he will win ABP finals. But let's take him at his best, right? That relies on the ability of people thinking that perhaps what they're doing is at the best interest of other people, right? To not break the system, just like what we are proposing in closing opposition, right? So what he never did, he never proved to us why would these people even have incentive in order to care for what the other people want in their lives, right? So comparatively on our world, where we don't have self-interest put on a pedestal as to guide your moral principles, at least we would have empathy as to put ourselves into the position and know what they would want, what they would want for the best of themselves, right? So this doesn't happen in like Goff's world where you have a self-interest as like the moral guiding into your own principles, right? So another thing that he literally just did is he just like accepted by whatever Sharik said about like minorities having more power to break out if they were to have self-interest in itself, right? So MIF literally already pointed out that like to prove as to how this would even happen, like demonstrate as to how having self-interest in minorities would even incentivize them to end every of their struggles, right? So conversely, and even in your world, how this majority will also have the self-interest to block the way of these minorities in order to get that right in the first place. We don't understand how this will exist even in their own world, right? So how did closing opposition come into this bit, right? So we proved to you how the natural instinct of people is to act in self-interest already, right? And beyond that, we told you that people are short-sighted, people are impatient, and they pursue only short-term self-interest. And also lastly, that how most people don't have access to information in order for them to protect their long-term self-interest to begin with, right? So how is this even important in our debate, right? So when CG came out to us and told us how having self-interest would not be able to protect vulnerable people who do not have resources in order for them to want to give into communities, right, and so on and so forth. And this is where our extension comes in, right? So because we told you in a world in which people don't put their self-interest as a guiding moral principle, we will be having we would see unhealthy individuals wealthy individuals being able to give their resources to this particular vulnerable group because they do not put their self-interest in order for them to conduct these certain things, right? So they are sacrificing their happiness, which is their wealth, in order for them to protect the weak, right? So why is this important to note? Because we believe comparatively in their world, these individuals who are so wealth minded and would just become richer in order for them to particular happiness that they still want to talk about, right? So in other instances into how political figures in our world, at least if they do not have self-interest as a center in their lives, they would have incentives to want to go into rural areas, perhaps to give political expression to people that do not have information in order for them to want to become better in the end of the day, right? So because they would want to appeal to these richer individuals in your world, they would want to gain more political power in order to self-fulfill you want to talk about. So this is only important to them in gospel, so they're not able to impact all these vulnerable people that we are able to cater to in our world, right? So before I move on to my second issue, sure.
Right. Your case is premised on the assumption that everyone in your world is going to act in this altruistic manner. Yeah. But your very example of the subprime mortgage crisis was one in which individuals didn't recognize self-interest of others and therefore allow a few people to profit immensely from the crash.
At least comparatively, it's better in our world when they do not have their own self-interest guiding their moral principles. Unless on your world where they would just be doing it for their own personal benefit and they would just ignore everything else that's happening with minorities or even happening in rural areas to begin with, right? So another issue in determining if we put should we put self-interest to gain happiness for all, because OG came up to us and talked about how we're benevolent individuals, we don't know if these people are even real to begin with in order to work to their self-interest. Is weird argumentation coming from them, right? So how is this I'm going to point out the contradiction coming within their own government bench, right? So because living in a world where you put your self-interest at a premium, right? So this means that you don't care about what people think if it doesn't coincide with what you think is self-interest. So what does this mean? This means that the very feeling of guilt that you would get if you were to discriminate another person doesn't exist in your world, because as long as you get the self-interest already to yourself, you will just like be ignorant of all the other things that's happening within the particular scenario, right? So you can't have best of both worlds, mutual, and just wake up. So number two is when we talk about like how in our world, at least like this, everything that OG said is contingent upon like people having equal access to information, people having access into like the information that they get, right? So why is this untrue? And we might them capable to pursue this kind of happiness is able to do so. But the trade-off is you will just like be ignoring all the fact that you're like particularly discriminative against like a minority just because they are not like capable enough to reach your self-fulfillment you still want to talk about, right? So like what was our like extension important in today's debate, right? Because we told you when you give up on your self-interest, it's actually a prerequisite for you to like get like more fulfillment in the end of the day, right? Because we believe that in a world where you coexist with other people and how you like would want to cooperate with other people in order to gain like a collective interest, right? What this means is that in a world at which people like cooperate in a system in where like you would rely on each other to gain happiness, and now putting like one individual's interest above another one would just hurt this entire system in itself, right? Because in order for you to fulfill that, you will do anything, perhaps even like sabotage another person, right? Like when we talk about like just destroying the particular system in order for you to get self-benefit, like what we just told you in like member space, right? So this disrupts the entire system in which you live in, because even though in our world we don't put self-interest as a premium, at least self-interest is just what is like the interest itself is just what they're getting out of the system in it for us. So therefore coexisting and working collectively will just at least like lead to a much more like self-fulfillment, which means like in our world at least to impact more people within that particular system for us to like benefit collectively, right? So how should you judge the debate? Basically, you should clarify on like which world does people benefit more from. Is it like self-interested people who have like moral principles as their guideline, or is it perhaps people who would want to take into consideration what is it that other people think about that particular scenario? And we believe that with all the reasons that we provided to you, this issue should go to start closing up.
Thank you very much. Close.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.